Hi, this is Pranjal Chandra, and you are listening to Budget on Political Reform.
When Armando Armas became a founding member of Popular Will, or Voluntad Popular in Venezuela, he hoped to reform the corrupt systems that he felt former President Hugo Chavez gave rise to. And in 2015, he succeeded in working with other opposition parties to win enough seats for an opposition-led National Assembly. But less than 2 years later, when the National Assembly convened to commemorate Venezuela's Independence Day, supporters of Chavez's successor, Nicolas Maduro, stormed the legislative office and attacked opposition leaders, including Armando. Armando is now in exile and hasn't been home in over a year. The opposition coalition has also dissolved, though individual parties remain.
The autocratization process in Venezuela has been ever going since Chavez arose into power in 1998. They have systematically persecuted people who have shown coherence, willingness, and determination to go against the system, and go against the system is not just to participate in elections, it's also not to participate when the conditions are not right. And this is my case.
The opposition held a majority of the seats. So how could Maduro persecute people like Armando and establish power so easily? For this episode of PPR, we are going to tell the situation through the eyes of Armando Armas, the Venezuelan opposition leader you heard from earlier. There's a lot to unpack here and a lot of people involved. We think it's important to start a little further back.
Our economic and political model was framed under the premise that we were an oil-producing country, and we depended. Our development basically depended on the oil price, and when this oil price fell, of course, things started to go wrong. In 1989, after 1983 economic crisis, there was this social type of crisis called El Caracazo, which was a massive social discontent, street protests in 1989. And then in 1992, there was this failed coup d'etat attempt led by Chavez. He went to prison, and then he was released by a president. He got like a presidential pardon, and then he arose into power in 1998.
Chavez focused primarily on building on social development schemes that were financed solely through heavy oil dependency. Venezuela became a petrostate, or a country that relies on natural resource exports instead of diversifying its industries, eventually stagnating its economy. While Chavez was able to cut down poverty by 20% during his presidency, the over-reliance on fossil fuels perpetuated a steady decline in oil prices and drastically increased government debt. He remained president until he died in 2013, and Nicolas Maduro, who was appointed to several positions under Chavez, took over. Since then, 15% of the population, or more than 5 million citizens, have fled the country. What is the way forward for Venezuela? How can the opposition party work to ensure democracy prevails again? Our interviewer, Pranjal Chandra, asked Armando Armas what he thinks about the many pressing challenges plaguing Venezuela today.
5 million Venezuelans have left the country, and there has been a crisis in making for a very long period of time. What is the crisis? What is this Venezuelan crisis that we keep on hearing about, according to you, and how do you see it?
They're doing this. They use institutions to control the population in sometimes very subtle ways. Some other times they're as tough as totalitarian regimes of the past. And this is the cause, or the main cause, why over 15% of our population, let's say over 5 million people, have left the country, mostly to Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Chile, Argentina. And also in the United States, there are like some sort of like 500,000 people in the United States, and there's like other 500,000 people across Europe. maybe more now in Spain. Many, because we're such a mixed culture, such a mix of identities and nationalities. We have like third generation, sons or let's say grandsons or granddaughters of immigrants, Spanish immigrants, Italian, Portuguese, and they have left to those countries as well.
He points out that through a subsidized food distribution program called CLAP, the Maduro government has been weaponizing food to garner votes in an electorate suffering from hunger and starvation. According to reports, nearly 83% of pro-Maduro voters state that CLAP is their primary method of getting food.
When they buy this type of food, the food, like they use it for two purposes. One, for make business with overpricing, and the one that actually make the way to the most needed people is the most needed people that are very, very tight to the regime. So they're loyalists.
Food and medicine costs have also skyrocketed in Venezuela in recent years, with families forced to make the tough decision to flee the country or suffer from hunger or malnutrition. According to Bloomberg's Café con Leche Index, 1 cup of coffee in January 2019 cost as much as 1,800 cups of coffee in January 2018. Armando sees this hyperinflation as a consequence of a state-led economic model during Chávez's presidency that allowed for extreme corruption.
Since the beginning of the so-called war on terror, which was in 2003, Venezuela received the greatest amount of revenues per oil in its history, in its old Republican history. Not in the late, like contemporary history, but in the whole history. So former ministers of planning and finance, Jorge Jordani and Héctor Navarro, respectively, they were loyalists from Hugo Chavez. They stated that the amount of money stolen from 2003 to 2013, that decade, was somewhere around $300 billion.
Héctor Navarro, who led 5 ministries during Chávez's rule, and Jorge Jordani, a former finance minister and Chávez's primary economic advisor, have in recent years called for an investigation to account for billions of dollars that have allegedly been embezzled during the 14-year term of Chávez's presidency.
I think this is directly related to mismanagement of the economy and hyperinflation, because, when they receive the money and they stole it and they have it, in hundreds of bank accounts in Switzerland, and this happened in January, just in judicial cases regarding Venezuelan corruption, there is over $35 billion in judicial cases in over 68 countries around the world.
Chávez's regime persists as Maduro's government has consistently targeted opposition party leaders, journalists, political leaders, or activists.
I was with a bunch of members of parliament staying at the hotel to go to the sessions, to the sessions of the National Assembly. We were together in a place, and I received a call from a person who was with the interim government, let's say, director of intelligence and counterterrorism and intelligence. He was in house arrest, and then he managed to flee out of the country, and now he's at the U.S. And he asked this friend of mine if he knew me. This guy Armando Armas, and because they have like people, informers, I guess, within police institutions and intelligence institutions that leak information, and they say, hey, they want to releasing a warning arrest against Armando Armas. Do you know him? This friend of mine. And this friend of mine called me right away and asked me to leave.
Many people like Armando have been jailed without warrants, faced harassment, threats, or persecution.
So I have to, take every few things I had, like in a backpack, and then in a couple of hours, organize a trip to the border, to the Colombian border, and then flee out of the country. And months after, they went to my mother's house with assault rifles, and they took her like for over 6 hours for interrogations. And of course, interrogations where I was and what I was doing, and they also released a capture order against my brother.
According to a joint report by the Human Rights Watch and the Penal Forum, there has been an active crackdown on dissent in recent years, with brutal attacks on protesters and opposers leading to injury or death. The targeted persecution and government repression, coupled with the constant threat to life and well being, have forced many who have raised voices against the government to go into exile.
We have been willing to give our lives, if I may say, or get in prison or get tortured. Sometimes I've had friends that have been killed, in protests. Close friends. But we are not willing to take lives because it's against our morals, right? So I guess in this type of conundrum, they have advantage over us because they are willing to go beyond. They're willing to get fair. They're willing, the regime, people from the regime, which is a minority, they're willing to, drug trafficking, human trafficking, money laundering, harassment. So they have they're not morally binded by anything. Whereas on the other side, we have many mistakes. We have to, this presents us a dilemma on how to, how to struggle, how to make a fight, how to compete, if I may say. And this is one of the things that generates the lack of strategic coordination among the majority of the population, which is represented by the democratic leadership. On the other hand, they don't have this problem, so they assume that they are criminals and they act as such. So that's why it has been difficult. This is not a balanced type of dynamic.
In conjunction with the lack of coordination demonstrated by the democratic leadership, Armando believes that there are other state and non-state actors supporting the current Venezuelan regime.
Iran, Cuba, Russia, and China, and others helping the Venezuelan regime, not just through military aid, intelligence, repression apparatus, money, and basically when you go to protest and the military, which is sustaining the regime, doesn't do anything about it, and they pick a side, of the oppressor, and we are not willing to take the weapons because we are a nonviolent movement, you get killed, as we have seen in Venezuela, over 200 people killed in protests, and right now we have over 350 political prisoners right now in Venezuela. I think there are also non-state actors like, for example, the National Army of Liberation, the Colombian National Army of Liberation, and the dissidents of FARC, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, the Revolutionary Armed Force of Colombia, which was a rebel group. They entered into politics, but their dissidents crossed the border. They went across the border and they found a safe haven in Venezuela. And these are non-state actors that are supporting the Venezuelan regime.
World over, we've seen opposition parties in countries beyond Venezuela that haven't been able to effectively counter existing ruling parties. In India, for example, the Bharatiya Janata Party has successfully managed to stay in power for almost 8 years with an increasing foothold over varied states in the country. In contrast, the Indian National Congress, the country's historically leading party, holds less than 10% of the seats in parliament today. This situation is not unique. Is it the lack of a concrete ideological narrative, a coordination problem, rise in populism, or plain mismanagement? What has prevented opposition parties from garnering a strong foothold, especially in countries facing dictatorial rule like Venezuela? Armando shares his views on the country's recent election and fall of multiple coalition parties through his experience as an opposition leader.
There has been a range of factors, both internal and external, which have led to this formidable regime, right? But the other aspect of this is the number of opposition parties. And in 2017, there was a coalition which fell apart. And I wanted to understand that this coalition which was formed against this, what led to the coalition falling apart, and